Derelict, desolate, and still ravaged from the constant raids and bombings of the world wars, Number 10 Rillington Place was a desperate home for desperate people. Jutting out from the war-torn street of Notting Hill in London, rubble, refuse, and even human remains were a common sight for those unfortunate enough to call this 3-story house home. Each floor had been broken up into a separate apartment, with no bathrooms and only a common outhouse at the end of the garden. There was nowhere for people to wash, and for those on the 3rd floor, there wasn't even a kitchen. This would be the homestead of one of the most disturbing serial killers Britain has ever known. His name was John Reginald Christie, although he often went by Reggie. He was born on April 8, 1899 in Halifax, and was the 6th out of 7 children. His father, Ernest John Christie, was a strict disciplinarian who didn't believe in showing his wife or his children affection. Growing up, punishments and beatings were in no short supply for John Christie. But strangely enough, the same could also be said for loving attention. John's mother and his older sisters absolutely adored him and overcompensated for the punishments his father would dole out by doing their best to spoil John. It was a confusing and troubling home to grow up in, but by his own admission, the defining moment of John's childhood had been the death of his maternal grandfather, David Halliday. David had been a contemptuous man, even quicker to anger than John's father, Ernest. John had once been completely terrified of him, but after watching David slowly deteriorate and eventually die from being ill, John was in heaven. The man he had so greatly feared his whole life was dead, and there was John, young, fit, and healthy, and he had never felt better about himself. John then turned his attention to academics. He won a scholarship to attend a private school and then one to go to a boarding school, where he sang in the church choir and was a Boy Scout. A literal Boy Scout. But socially, John was an outcast. Former classmates described him as, quote, a queer lad who kept to himself and was not very popular. And this was, unfortunately, how many people would see John for the rest of his life. But things only became worse when John tried to get a girlfriend. He had very little success with the ladies, and the girls who did end up giving him a chance usually ended up breaking up with him shortly afterward. This was all allegedly because John had difficulties sexually performing, and once news about this got out, his peers began calling him things like Reggie No Dick and Can't Do It Christie. An already psychologically delicate young man was then drafted into the army to go and fight in the First World War. He saw combat, but in June 1918 he was critically injured in a mustard gas attack. John later said that even after months of treatment, he was still left blind and mute for 3.5 years. However, records show that John was released from the hospital and sent back to the front lines. It's highly unlikely that a soldier who was both blind and mute would be allowed back into combat and not discharged from the military. So we should take these claims by John with a pinch of salt. He did, however, return to Halifax in 1919, where he met 18-year-old Ethel Simpson. People who knew Ethel around the 1920s and the 1930s described her as a refined, well-bred, and educated young woman who was extremely attractive. She was a talented shorthand typist, and she often found work as a secretary wherever she went. This was the woman that John married in 1920, but only a few years into their marriage, people began describing Ethel as meek, unattractive, and someone who seemed to have a desperate need for male attention. Part of the shift in their marriage had come from a tragic loss the young couple experienced very early on when Ethel suffered a miscarriage. This traumatic event seemed to drive a wedge between husband and wife. After that, John returned to an old vice, soliciting prostitutes. But when the brief excitement that provided lost its appeal, he began stealing. John was later caught in the act and arrested. He was sentenced to 3 months in prison. Far from being deterred after his stint in prison, John was convicted again in 1923, this time for obtaining money under false pretenses and under the threat of violence. Up until then, Ethel had stood by her wayward husband, but when he was released, and moved to London instead of coming home, she went her own way too. There were rumors to explain why Ethel didn't follow her husband, and they said that Ethel was having an affair with her employer. But people who knew the couple at the time didn't put much weight into the gossip. Instead, they pointed the finger at John, at his life of crime, at his constant solicitation of prostitutes, and the rumors that he'd stolen from his very own parents as the reason why the couple had parted ways. On paper, and in the eyes of the law, the Christies were still married, but they wouldn't actually see each other again for another 10 years. Despite his history, John joined the Royal Air Force, and Ethel went to live with her family. During the years, John was in and out of prison and buried thick in a life of crime. But Ethel was desperately trying to rebuild her life with a man who loved her. His name was Vaughan Brindley, and he had two goals in life. The first was to become financially stable enough to support a family, and the second was to marry Ethel Christie. But when Vaughan stood on Ethel's doorstep, proposing to her in 1932, she had to come clean. She had told them that her husband John had died in the war, but as we all know, he was very much alive and living in London. Ethel would first have to find him and then get him to agree to a divorce if she were to ever marry Vaughan. But the second piece of news she had to break to the man standing in her front doorstep had the potential to be a real deal breaker. Ethel discovered that she was unable to have children. The news destroyed Vaughan, who then called off their whole relationship, and he left Ethel. With her dreams also now crushed, Ethel caught wind of John's latest arrest and went to visit him in prison. There, between cold, metal prison bars, husband and wife saw each other again for the first time in over a decade. A tentative truce was formed, one where John promised to forego his life of crime and where Ethel agreed to leave the peaceful and beautiful home she shared with her family in Halifax and move back in with John. She can't have been overly impressed by the destitute streets of Rillington Place, and even less so with the condition of the apartment she was now to live in. But it was a fresh start. She and John occupied the ground floor, which gave them direct access to the garden, and the Christies found a new lease on life. John kept his promise and found steady work, and Ethel was able to catch the train to visit her family in Sheffield whenever she wanted. John would use the time Ethel took to see her family to solicit prostitutes. But this time, it seemed like Ethel was at least aware of what he was doing. But what she wasn't aware of is what happened in 1943 when John brought home the 21-year-old Ruth First. Ruth wasn't a prostitute, per se, but worked in a factory and resorted to prostitution when she couldn't make ends meet. She'd met John at a bar and had agreed to sleep with him back at his apartment in number 10 Rillington Place. There, however, in the throes of passion, John tied a rope around Ruth's neck and strangled her to death. He then buried her under the floorboards in the kitchen and used the cover of darkness the following night to bury her in the communal back garden. In 1944, he brought home one of his colleagues from work. 31-year-old Muriel Amelia Eady suffered from bronchitis, and John claimed that he had the perfect cure. He put a mixture of pungent things into a jar, inserted a tube, and told Muriel that all she had to do was breathe in through the tube. Muriel listened, but she didn't see that John inserted another tube into the jar that connected to the gas pipe in the kitchen. Muriel went out cold. John then sexually assaulted her several times before he strangled her to death. He buried her outside beside Ruth. In the meantime, the new neighbors had moved in upstairs. They were both young, both suffered from learning disabilities, and had just had a baby. Timothy Evans was said to be an insecure young man with a wild imagination. He often told stories about himself that made him seem brighter and more exciting than he actually was. But the truth was, he had an IQ of only about 70. He often drank most of his wages away, leaving his 18-year-old wife, Beryl, with little to feed herself and the baby. Beryl also struggled with numbers, and whenever the money ran out, Timothy would beat her. John often went upstairs to break up the fights between them, and he was there again when the couple found out that they were pregnant with their second child. With things being as tight as they were, Beryl wanted an abortion, but they were illegal in Britain at the time. Desperate, the young couple turned to John, and John told them that he could perform the procedure for them. During Ethel's next trip to Sheffield to see her family, Beryl made her way downstairs to John's flat, and that was the last time her husband Timothy ever saw her alive. Later that evening, when Timothy went down to check on her, John blocked the door to the apartment and told Timothy that Beryl was dead. He then convinced Timothy to leave town and leave his young daughter Geraldine behind too. Timothy listened, but a short time later, back in his hometown in Wales, Timothy handed himself in to the police and told them that he had accidentally killed Beryl. He said that he had accidentally poisoned her when trying to abort the baby and that he had put her body in the drain outside of the house. The police investigated his claim and found John at home in Rillington Place, but that was about all they did find. They didn't find Beryl, her daughter Geraldine, Muriel, or Ruth. They searched the property again on December 8th. This time, the bodies of Beryl, Geraldine, and a 16-week-old fetus were discovered in the outhouse back in the yard. An autopsy revealed that both Beryl and Geraldine died from strangulation. It was then that Timothy found out that Geraldine was also dead, and when asked if he was the one responsible for their deaths, he simply replied, yes. Timothy was then taken to court, and the star witness against him was none other than John Christie himself. Timothy was found guilty of murdering his wife and daughter, and he was sentenced to hang on the 31st of January. Meanwhile, at number 10 Rillington Place, the Christies had a new upstairs neighbor, but John and Ethel both obviously hated them. They were a family of immigrants from the West Indies, and neither of the Christies were very happy about having black neighbors. On December 6, 1952, John then used the excuse of having these neighbors to do something completely despicable. In his own words, quote, "My wife has been suffering a great deal from persecution and assaults from the black people in the house, number 10 Rillington Place, and had to undergo treatment at the doctor for nerves. On 14 December, I was awakened by my wife moving about in bed. I sat up and saw that she had appeared to be convulsive. Her face was blue and she was choking. I did what I could to try to restore breathing, but it was hopeless. It appeared to be too late to call for assistance. That's when I couldn't bear to see her, so I got a stocking and tied it around her neck to put her to sleep. I left her in bed for 2 to 3 days and didn't know what to do. Then I remembered some loose floorboards in the front room. Then I believe I went back and put her in a blanket or a sheet or something and tried to carry her, but she was too heavy, so I had to sort of halfway carry, half drag her and put her in that depression and cover her up with earth. I thought it was the best way to lay her to rest." On January 19th, 1953, John brought home a 25-year-old Rita Nelson, another prostitute from Belfast, who was pregnant. John told her that he could perform an abortion for her, and Rita agreed to go back with him to his apartment. She inhaled gas from a jar, not knowing that John was pumping gas from the stove into it as well. He then repeatedly assaulted her before he strangled her to death. He wrapped her in a blanket and hid her in an alcove in the kitchen, which he covered with wallpaper. In February of that same year, John brought Kathleen Maloney, a 26-year-old prostitute from Ladbroke, back to his apartment. He raped, strangled her, and hid her body in the same alcove. About a month later, he struck again. This time he targeted 26-year-old Hectorina McLennan, who was actually a former roommate. She and her boyfriend had once lived with John for months at Rillington Place, and she didn't think anything of being invited back to the same house after bumping into John on the streets. There, she received the same treatment as Rita and Kathleen before her. Almost unbelievably, John then sublet his apartment. With 4 bodies hidden away in the kitchen and even more in the backyard, John moved out of number 10 Rillington Place. One thing then led to another, and the bodies hidden behind the wallpaper in the kitchen were finally discovered. John Christie was arrested, and at first he only admitted to the murders of the women in the alcove and his wife, Ethel. But when the skeletons in the backyard were also finally found, he confessed that he'd murdered them as well. He then admitted to killing Beryl Evans, too. In court, John was found guilty and sentenced to death for his crimes. On July 15th, he was led to the gallows at HM Prison, Pentonville. The same gallows with the same executioner Timothy Evans had just a few years before his sentence was carried out. Timothy Evans was then posthumously awarded an official pardon. That is 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, the host, and you don't have to tell me. Go ahead and click delete on that email that you're typing out to me right now. You don't have to let me know that this episode is not 10 minutes long. It's more like 15 minutes at this point. I know. The time got away from me. I didn't feel like I could cut another 5 minutes from the story. I wanted to get all of that information in. At some point, go back and listen. I picked up the pace substantially because I was like, oh snap, this is going to take too long. Merry Christmas, I guess? I don't know. You got a bonus today. And that's kind of the way I'm going to treat this episode. I'm going to throw it in here on the weekend, and there you go. It's an addition to the normal Tuesday, Thursday episodes for you. And that's it. That's your episode. Thank you so much for listening to 10-Minute, 15-Minute Murder. Bye.